Tack så mycket. That's all my Swedish that I know. So thank you for the opportunity to address you in English. I appreciate the ability of my Nordic cousins to learn many languages and be able to connect with people all over the world. So I'm going to speak a little bit about design considerations for timber frame architecture, a little bit on the aesthetic side, how I think about when designing a structure that will be timber framed, the kind of design process I might go through, and then also a little bit about technical considerations for the construction of timber frame buildings, walls, roof, foundations, all of that. I'm wondering if I could get an idea in the audience, who here is an architect? A few? And engineers? So a couple. And then other people are in construction, carpenters, timber framers? Most people. And I imagine that even as a carpenter or timber framer, you find yourself in the position of designing a structure or designing an entire building. You'll just draw it up in your spare time, you know, in 10 minutes is what your clients think it's. Yeah. So, very nice. I was trained as an architect. I went to school for architecture. And as I finished school, I was trying to figure out how I wanted to make my way in life, and thought that maybe I didn't want to, like many of my fellow students, go to New York City and design very fancy, important buildings. I didn't see that life for me, and I thought maybe I would go to try and work for a builder and learn a little bit more about building, but also be in a smaller pond, we say, you know. And at the very, very last day of architecture school, I was literally, you know, walking like this, and I see on the floor a folder, an explanation of a conference, and these pictures were on the folder. It was a conference for the Timber Framers Guild, and all I could see from up here was this picture of a lot of people on a structure, and they were very happy. This is hard to see here. Everyone's, yeah! Also, there were a lot of men with their shirts off, and that was enough, so I would pick it up. And, but it looked very, very interesting to me. People working together, I saw, and people very happy about their work. And also what I could see of what they were doing, I could see it. I could see the structure, and that was very appealing, and that was really, from the very beginning, you know, the start of my journey with the Timber Framers Guild. So we do have a long history in North America. I'm very excited to see the beginnings of the guild here in Scandinavia. So I wish you all success. I've worked really this whole time since 1990 in mostly residential architecture and mostly timber framing. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of projects, some in collaboration with architects. This was collaborating with another architect as the consultant, sometimes as the architect and timber frame designer. It's a wonderful experience to be able to design a very fancy house. You have a lot of money, you can be very creative, and in some ways my heart is also maybe more towards the simpler, smaller structures. This is actually my home that I don't live in anymore but still own, the first house I built in New Hampshire. And you could fit this house just in the living room of this house. So It's a wide range. Johannes had asked me about commercial structures as well, and I have done some over the years, mostly for institutions, library addition, which I'll just mention briefly later, a carousel, which when they finally built, it's very hard to see this timber framing is actually all steel, but they did use my design, but then built it in steel. It's still a very lovely building. Projects with the Timberframers Guild. This is one in Suriname that was a partnership with a local group. And Matthias, you were asking about the Virginia Military Institute. This was one of the projects we did for an addition to a women's shelter in Virginia. So we do have quite a history in North America of timber framing, and this is right in the town where I'm living right now, Sandown Meeting House, from 1774, and here are some plans for something you can buy today, and a lot of people are very much interested in this kind of a style still, so this is one timber framing tradition, and I guess in this style, it's very much set what the shape of the building will be, what the timber frame will be. In some ways, you start with that timber frame and put rooms in it. So the form is very set, and certainly this is a way that people have been living for a long time. When I started working with timber framers in design, this is most of how I was approached. I am going to build a colonial. Can you show me where the rooms go? You know, so the frame is set and then put the rooms inside it. And I still do that. That's one approach to design. So here is, just took this out of a modern, just off the internet, plan book. So you can pick that ready-made today, same kind of concept and, frame you might see today. Then, and I'm sure some of you get this, the house is completely designed, possibly very complicated. Can you put a timber frame in that, please? Has anyone been in that situation? And sometimes, oh, hi. Sometimes that works well and sometimes not so well. I have this one as an example. The design was very set, and then I was asked, can you put the frame in? Let's see if I have a view of this. So, I did, the drawing was actually, I did have a SketchUp drawing from the architect, and then I kind of redrew it. It was just a concept, so I redrew it, but I did take that and put the, put the timber frame in. But we had a few spots, for instance, on this first floor, you can start to see the beginnings of a grid here with timbers going this way down here, and then another line of timbers, except we couldn't have a post right there or right there, or, right there because there's a nice big door. So we design the frame and then we fix all the problems of... You're laughing because you've been in this same situation, right? So over here, we can't have a post coming down all the way here, so I create a truss up in the roof structure. A little hard to see there, but maybe you can see it right there. So we create this truss to stop this post. This is in an area where you might get 2 feet of snow on the roof. So I would rather designed from the beginning to have all the loads go down to the floor and everything, much more simpler concept. But these are the situations you find yourself in sometimes. Similar on the other side. Another post coming down with a lot more load and ended up putting in, we thought steel, then wood, a very large beam to take all the load of that so that the kitchen design stays proper. So I'm trying when I design to think about all things at the same time, which can get a little difficult, but as timber framers, you're always used to thinking in 3 dimensions in any case. So thinking about the floor plan, which most clients have the best understanding of, they can see, this plan and the layout of where the rooms go, but always at the same time thinking how that is going to be in 3 dimensions. And to my own aesthetic, to end up with forms that are fairly simple, can be understood. When you walk up to the house, the main thing is happening in the middle, and other less important things are happening to the sides. And that's just how the plan is laid out too. The main living space here, a smaller place to gather here and to eat here, a retreat for the parents, that's that frame there. And for this project, a lot of the pieces in between where you don't see the timber frame was just filled in with other kind of structure. What I wanted to say about the plan, though, is going back to this kind of a plan. This kind of a plan is very much a grid, or like a checkerboard or chessboard, 1 square, 1 square. So you make that grid and you say 1 square is your kitchen, 1 square your living room, or 2 squares, but everything goes by the grid and the squares. And what I've tried to develop is there's still a grid work, but it's more, I thank the gentleman to the side here, almost in the back, that's wearing a plaid shirt. I think it's the same in Swedish, right? Plaid, right? Where, and also right here, where you might have, you still have lines intersecting, but different spaces, because there's a different hierarchy of importance in the space, and where those things intersect then also become your main spaces. So I have, a major line here, a minor line here of stairs, and a small little study or sleeping space. Similarly, major here for the sleeping space, and then a little minor in-between space for a closet, a resting area. So this idea of an interweaving or a plaid floor plan instead of a checkerboard floor plan. So there is another example where instead of a number of squares, you have a much smaller line here that is your access, your circulation between rooms, main space this way too, and another line going this way. That's not uncommon for just architects, the way that a lot of architects would work, right? Creating these major and minor lines and paths. But in timber framing, at least in North America, that was kind of a different approach, because there was, at least where I live in the northeast part of the United States, a long tradition of this more traditional square way of thinking. So just a project I did a number of years ago, using this approach, and also trying to bring in a couple of spots, the natural timbers, a little harder to see there, and in the bedroom here, to be a little bit of a reminder of the tree, of where the wood is coming from. This was also, we were talking in the car about timber braces, knee braces. These clients didn't really want to see the diagonal braces, and Rupert said, well, why are you doing a timber frame? But we came up with a different approach where all of the bracing is inside the wall, just in that structure, an infill structure. And so we were able to avoid the diagonal braces, which they didn't want in the project. So, too much? This does give you the opportunity in a lot of cases to have each room have its own identity. Even a hallway here, has its own identity, and sometimes you could take that to an extreme. Every little space has a timber. Here we are, here's our closet, here's our little space here. It can be too much, and I think I do. At a certain point, I will change the plan to fit, once the frame begins to emerge as a design, I might then change the plan to fit that so it goes in both directions. I've done projects like this where, every little space has its own roof, has its own special thing. And, we get into a situation where the intersection, I think I have a better view of that. Again, the design was set, and then how do we put the timber frame in? I think in the end we worked it out so that everything kind of mixed, played well, but this was a design that was already designed. I don't know that I would have designed it this way, because to me, these frames almost seem like they're in a little bit of a battle I'm not sure who won the war on that one, but to me, I'm feeling a lacking of harmony, even though each of the spaces is probably has a very nice feel when you're in it. When you look at the total experience in the home, I think maybe too much of a clash, too much of an argument between these frames that are trying to get along. So a little bit about division of spaces. This is a project by another timber framer, so I wasn't involved in the design, but it's beautiful, lovely space, and I'm wondering about if that was after the fact, they needed a place. It looks like there's the broom, so maybe that's the little room for the broom, or could be a bathroom there. And I can also imagine maybe the designer originally thought there would be a wall, all along this timber, and then someone said, but the frame's so beautiful, we don't want to cover it up. And I kind of agree, but you see a tension in this picture between, again, is this just not important? Then maybe it doesn't even need to be right there. Or did the timber frame, have a fight with this little space, and then the timber frame won? I would almost rather see, that wall go all the way across there and just have a second space where those little rooms can occur. And I don't mean to pick on this. It's very, very, very beautiful. I think it's a classroom space, very healing place for children, I think. I found this picture also not by me, but I thought it was a very nice division of space in what's kind of a traditional timber frame design. I don't know if this was, I can't see if it's an older frame that was repurposed, if this post used to go down all the way, and if they opened it up, but just in a room where in a traditional timber frame design where you might have, if you divided the whole thing into four parts, you have 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1/4, 1/2, 1/4 division. And that's, if you think about the floor plan, that's often what you might end up with in a room, because here's a hallway leading to maybe the kitchen back there, or bedrooms, same up above. How do you break down that space? The timbers have such a strong effect in the room that, this nicely creates, this is in effect the room, and that's secondary just by having the timber at that lower space. That can work for you, or it can work against you. Sometimes, the placement of the timber in the space can be so strong that it creates a break in two spaces. It breaks it apart. And for instance, if you can imagine, if they wanted to put the sofa back in that spot, you'd feel like you were sitting in a different room talking to your friends. So it can be a positive and a negative in how those timbers are placed, but it certainly has a very, very strong effect in a space. So a couple of examples where I thought, well, this bed, I think it's centered nicely between these two very, very big, heavy trusses, but to me, I would be a little uncomfortable laying in that bed, feeling like I was about to be sliced on either side. I did a project in years past, and the client wanted a hip roof, to wrap in their bedroom, but it created a situation where there would be a diagonal beam directly across the bed, overhead. But to me, I thought that would be a very uncomfortable way to be sleeping, and possibly not. I don't follow a lot of feng shui directly, but I think about those principles, and that to me was very bad for marital harmony, to have a beam directly across. Here's one. It's just to the side of the bed down here, and I thought this was potentially could be very nice. Very much smaller timber. It's of a height you could almost touch it, so it's more friendly to you. So a very different kind of beam next to the bed, and it creates this, it's a very small little extra space there. I mean, this is a small room, but it helps to make that you almost feel like you have another little extra space in your room. To me, this is an entirely different scale and has an entirely different effect. Of course, that whole room is very, very big, and that again, I'm sure you get this sometimes with clients where they want 20 feet or 5 meters, 8 meters to the roof in this very, very big room. I get when I talk with clients, a lot of times they say, well, because we want the Christmas tree here, or we want to be able to, when my daughter is getting married and she comes down the stairs, we want, to be able to see, they think of design at these very special moments. And I understand that. I don't mean to make fun, because those are the moments you remember in your life. But the other moments of where you have your egg in the morning and your coffee, or where you read a book while you're relaxing at night, are just as important. So I'm always thinking about these spaces as well. This is just another example where I like how the light is coming in, but maybe in the drawing, in the cross section, that looked a little better than, in the room, you can't really see the windows from when you're laying in the bed. So that's why, I showed some of the SketchUp drawings. I'm trying to model everything now in 3 dimensions. It can be a little deceiving about the size of a room, but it will show you, what you can and can't see in a space. So just again about beam placement, I don't know that every room has to be symmetrical. It doesn't bother me that this is to one side, but the way the beam is placed makes it look like I can't tell whether this is supposed to hold up the beam or they're just fitting it in. Very heavy, and everything in the room kind of makes you feel weighted down, and again, you're sitting directly under this very heavy space. Just a little contrast, a lot of variation between larger pieces and then the smaller pieces. And we also, in this project, because they wanted these extra window seats, we just brought the timber frame, forward so you could see it, and then put that back, just extra framed part where past the timber frame. So separation of spaces, again, this is a very typical condition, a design of timber frames, and how you would separate to put rooms within that space. This is a project I'm working on right now, and I've been experimenting with here's the floor plan. We had a meeting live with the clients, but online for this one, and experimenting with using, showing right on the screen the spaces to see if they can understand. But the timber frame in this area, so large purlins coming across in the roof, all open to the roof, but how do you close off these spaces? In particular, everything follows the frame, but do the walls go all the way up to the roof, or do you stop at a certain point, kind of like in the previous slide? And so this is a very, very schematic stage. Are you able to see that from there? It's a little extra bright. So it's at a very schematic stage, but just to show, does this closet just come up to here? And I actually wanted to just bring it all up. And again, the clients thought, well, the timber frame's so pretty, I want to see all of it. I think it's fine to me, but it kind of makes it look a little bit like this is a little phone booth, tucked in. So I would prefer to have that go all the way up, but we're still working on the design. And the same thing on this side, we have a bathroom, and do you want this space above? So there we are looking towards it. There's the whole frame. Unless you have a ladder or a stair or some way to get up there, and some use for that, to me, to my eye, it would be better just to cover it. And that also represents a lot of work in the timber framing, but I like that your eye can go past, but maybe it's, again, too much. It also does raise a good question, though, about emplacement of braces, where you place the walls, to one side, to the other side, place them to one side of the beam. If you have, in America, all by inches, 8-inch post, 6-inch beam, and it's all to the center, do you place the wall to the side of the post, to the side of the beam? There's no good answer, or in this case, actually, you can see the X-ray of the frame there. No braces, because we had a wall there. They just decided to remove the braces. So here's a very similar condition where the wall stops, you see the timber frame past, but you can't really get to that space. It's just for your eye. I have a mixed feeling. This was another project, a similar kind of concept where you have the two main central purlins. We had a little office space, and this was kind of designed by the client. He came with a very developed design to me that he had produced himself, and he had this high dormer up here. So we decided in this case to kind of make a little roof just for this room, so that from this room you could see up and towards that dormer. I think it worked out okay in the end. Back to wall placement, here's a early study for this room. That to me is not good. That's the brace coming through from the other side. I don't mind a brace across a window, but that looks like I wasn't really paying attention. So when designing the frame, now I'm trying to have all of the architecture in place, even if it's very schematic like this. This tells enough. I don't need the detail, but it tells enough about a consideration that we might not have thought about. Here's a good example of placing the wall by the post. In the floor plan, it probably looked very good, but here it looks very, very blank in relation to this side, and you can see that last purlin is just to one side of the wall, and maybe the answer is not in the timber frame. Maybe this wall needs to have another level of detail or some wood cladding just to bring it more in harmony with the frame, but it looks very abrupt, like you had one thing happening and then all of a sudden something different there where that wall is. But to my thinking, that probably looked very proper in the floor plan, but when you see it in 3 dimensions, then maybe it didn't quite work out the way they thought. I like the timbers across the windows. I think it's nice. This I thought also very nice harmony of the timber work with the windows, and you can see just very small here, the timbers going across the window trim. To me, that brings to light that, at least in North America, most of the time, the enclosure is to the outside of the timber frame. You're seeing the whole timber frame. So if they're in a separate plane, they can be doing separate things. And I actually find it appealing when that looks well balanced, to have those two things working together, but they highlight the difference between the two. And here's an example where actually the windows were designed to perfectly fit inside the timbers. This was that shape was a little bit of a theme. We even followed onto the front porch there. So some technical considerations. There's a lot going on in this photograph. This project, they decided to do the enclosure wrap with conventional framing, and my understanding is that that's what most people are doing in Scandinavia. Is that correct? So both on the walls and then on the roof, you can start to see just on top boards, and then a layer of conventional framing, cellulose insulation. What might be very familiar to you. I would say on the projects I work on, maybe 20% use this kind of enclosure, and a lot of times that's because it's easier for the people doing the work. They understand it. Maybe they're carpenters that are used to doing this kind of work, so it's very easy to tell the crew just to do it the regular way. But of course, if you have a whole structure inside, it's a bit redundant. I'll talk about floor systems first, but on the walls, in North America, I would say what's most common are the structural insulated panels. And is everyone familiar with the SIPs, or the structural insulated panels? It's like a sandwich. So some kind of plywood or some sort of wood structural panel on the outside, a thick core of foam, different kinds of foam available, and then on the inside the same wood. And you can also get with like a plaster finish on the inside, but it comes ready-made in a panel. It would have the windows already cut out, so it's all ready to just install in 1 day or 2 days on the outside of the frame. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So for floors, between, let's say, the first floor and the second floor, what does floor need to do? For one, separate the space, or so you don't fall to the first floor when you're on the second floor. It's inconvenient. So the very most basic version of that would be just boards right on top of the timbers. I do this on, I would say about 1/3 of the projects I work on. Just put the floorboards down and we're done. It's the least expensive way to do it. In this project, they actually have boards and then another product to take care of sound, just a little bit to have a sound barrier, and then a more finished floor. So it's 3 layers, but still no airspace, and all together maybe about 5 centimeters, and not very good to separate sound, not good at all to separate the vibration sound. You hear every footstep. And in the case where you just do the boards, you always have, over time, it's kind of like it's always snowing in the house, because everything from upstairs is slowly coming downstairs, and I always think of it going into my soup, on the stove. So I like to have a little bit more separation. So this is a system I most commonly use: timber, some sort of ceiling that could be boards, or it could be a gypsum board ceiling, a plaster ceiling, a little bit of a space. So in the US, a 2x4, so about 3.5 inches, or I should have my centimeters proper, a little less than 10 centimeters. And then a plywood subfloor, and then a finished floor. Could be any flooring on top of that. So everything's working together. You have your timber structure that's doing the main work. The little, I call them baby floor joists, they're just creating a little bit of an air separation for sound, a place to put wiring, a place to put a little bit of insulation if you wanted to, both for sound and heat separation if you wanted to, and then you can do any finish on the floor above that. So this is, I would say, the most common thing I end up doing. And then about a quarter of the time, a full floor on top of the floor. So conventional framing on top of the timber framing of some kind. This gives you the advantage of both the separation of space, the sound separation, but also now you can fit all of your mechanical systems. In the US, it's pretty common to have air heating and cooling. So the large ducts, I know that's less common in Europe and Scandinavia. So a space to do all of those things. Also can be redundant in structure, although you see here there's just a main beam and no secondary timbers here. So they're trying to balance between. This is a system that's used at Benson Woodworking, where they've created a standoff. It's kind of the same concept where you have a large cavity for all those systems to go in, but with the smallest amount of material to create it. So this is much more like a commercial floating floor you'd see in a commercial building. I'm just starting to do some projects now that are using a version of this. That I don't think they're licensing this exact system, but to create a system similar to this. The advantage here with the standoff is that you can go in both directions. You know, you don't need to go through those the floor framing to put any of your mechanicals in. This is meant to go to what? Yeah, it's a good question. You would still have on top some sort of a subfloor and finished floor, and down below these panels, which are removable. So I think that you would have a little bit less sound separation than if the ceiling was continuous. But in the floor above, they could also do a layer for sound attenuation. Remind me what time I'm supposed to go until. Half an hour. Perfect. This is one that I thought was very interesting. I saw this on EcoNest, Robert Laporte's Facebook page 2 days ago. They have a ceiling system that is just, it's going all the way up to the roof. So as I can understand from this picture, there's no room up above that living room. That's just empty for the light to come down. And then they do like a rice paper ceiling over this. So you get this, that would be the effect in the end, a very diffuse light coming in from above. And then he will also install lighting in there, so at night you can get the same effect coming down. I find that very, very beautiful. It does require you to have this very empty space up above, so I'm not sure about that. And I'm also wondering, he must have a plan for how you get and clean the top of that paper over time, or maybe you're supposed to replace it every year. I'm just seeing this now, and I have questions I want to know. This is another floor system we're doing in garage below, and the building code in the US requires you to have fire separation if you're building over a garage space, and also just have it well sealed also for carbon monoxide or anything like that getting in above the space. So you're required, did you have a question? No. So you're required to have a layer of a gypsum board, you know, for fire separation in there. So we're doing a layer of ceiling boards, 5/8 inch layer of the fire separation, plywood, finished floor. But the interesting thing is that the boards are only 1 inch, but they're spanning, you know, a meter across, so that's not quite the span, and we're using the plywood above, so we're almost creating a little structural panel in the sandwich, in the build-up there. No space for mechanicals, so this is a space that's secondary to be finished later, and they'll just figure out how to do that at some other time. So here's a photo of that structural insulated panel, the wood on one side, the wood on the other, and the foam in the middle. Some sort of exterior waterproofing, and also rain screen to let the water move if it gets in behind the wall, and then some finish on the outside of that. As you can see, they go on very quickly. The sections are pre-cut. It could all, in a small house, go up in a day or a couple of days on a larger building. Really no waste on site if everything is figured out ahead of time. And less labor cost for your crews on site, because it all just comes, it's on in a day. I say down here, these are the positives, possible negatives, less labor investment. So if it's coming from somewhere else, it's less work for your crew or for you, less work locally. So that's a balance between, for some people, the pressure of getting something up quickly. There might be additional costs in having it take 3 weeks or more to put the outside of the building on. This might be a better choice. And for some places, you lose the opportunity to pay your workers to do that work. Also, for an owner builder who's doing something by themselves, where their labor is free and all their friends' labor is free, it's a missed opportunity, and this would be much more expensive. It can be a higher cost for the material up front. A lot of the foams are a petroleum product, so that can be a concern. For me, I'm in the middle, because you're using these kind of resources, but you're using them to lower the amount of energy that you're going to use in the home. And also, at least you're hoping that this will last on the outside of the home for a fairly long time. So the investment in using those resources, I'm okay with, I'm comfortable with. To have a foam coffee cup, which you use for a minute and throw out, it seems like a bad use of that material. This, to me, is a better use of the material, but I know some people would prefer not to use a petroleum product at all, so that could be an issue. And these panels are very strong, just like building the exterior shell from conventional framing. You could remove a lot of the timber framing, possibly, and still have the building stand. It can be structurally redundant. So I at least try, when I'm using the panels, to design so that it works with the timber frame, so that the panel is doing a job and the frame is doing a job. This was a project with just conventional framing, but because of that, we actually eliminated the timber framing on the walls of the building. So it's really, in the US, we might call it a hybrid. The frame is not a standalone frame. We built the framed walls, put the beam up. The center of the building is all timber framed, but the frame and the outside enclosure are kind of each doing a job. And I don't do this as much as I might want to, only because sometimes there's a little problem with communication in the different building trades. And unless you have a good working relationship, or you're going to do all of the pieces yourself, there can sometimes be a disconnect in communication of how of all the conventional framing gets set up. It seems like it would be easy to just say, build a wall this high, or a pocket for my beam, space to put this on, but a lot of the timber framers I work with are shy to trust that everything will be in place, or the stick framers are unsure. The people doing the conventional frame are resistant to working with another trade, which is unfortunate. Shouldn't be like that. This project, this is the addition to a library, just a very small space. This is the main, also very small library, and eventually they'll add to this side, another main large library building. So this is just the first step to connect, here in the floor plan, the older library here, the brick building. Here's it's really just an entryway, a ramp up to the other space, a small bathroom here, stairs down to a new basement, and just an entry, and eventually these windows will turn into a door. It seemed like a lot going on to do a full timber frame with posts coming down and beams and braces in the way. So we just did a timber frame roof on top of conventionally framed walls. So that's another way to marry the two, just to have all that roof structure sitting on top. I guess we're going to have a panel on this later, so I don't know that I'll speak on this so much, but a few different companies and individuals I've worked with that are experimenting with other more high-performance enclosure systems, trying to get, in some cases, the framing as light and as minimal as possible, but maybe a deeper space for getting closer to the passive house standards. And you can see on all of these a lot of pieces, a lot of components. The plus would be, when done right, really you can get up to like a passive house type standard, very high insulation value, possibly quite good use of ecological materials, and just a lower carbon footprint. But to some people this can be very complicated, hard to control if they're not familiar with all the systems and all the components, and confusing for the carpenters on site if they don't have experience with this. So it definitely requires a lot more attention, probably worthwhile attention, but I'm just seeing these options now on projects I'm working on in use. And also some alternatives to the foam infill on SIPs. A graphite, who knew? Adding graphite makes it better insulating, lighter, and not as expensive. It's all good. A straw panel, which is interesting. Instead of building straw bales piece on piece, someone's working with creating a panel. For foundations, here, are you doing typically the buildings are just on a slab with no basement, or you would have a basement underneath? No basement? Both. Okay. In Denmark, no basement, you're saying. Too wet, yes. Yeah, so you dig down 6 inches and you have the ocean, right? So certainly in the colder part of the United States, a basement is typical because where I live, you need to go down 1.5 meters just to be below the frost depth. And so as long as you've gone that far, you might as well go all the way and have space down there. So the question is really in the timber frame. I'm sorry, that's a little hard to read. There's your timber post. Is it going to be able to sit right evenly on the foundation, or which pushes the wall perhaps to the outside, or will the wall all be even with the foundation and push the timber frame to the inside? Also, if you have a heavy snow load, you have a lot of load coming down to the foundation wall. Conventional construction in the US, you can use a very minimal amount of reinforcing or steel in the foundation, but when you have a point load like that, where you might have, I don't know, 5 or 8 or 10,000 kilograms of weight coming down in one spot, you need a little more attention to the reinforcing in the foundation because of those point loads. So how the timber frame sits on those on the exterior walls is a consideration. Here we have a good amount of insulation to the outside of the wall and a structural insulated panel that also goes to the outside of the frame, and they almost, because of the thickness, they almost create a continuous line here. The insulated panel is hanging out over, it's suspended over the foundation, just with 1 foot on and 1 foot off. but because it's fastened back to the timber frame, it can be supported that way. So in this case, these walls are not considered to be structural. The timber post, which is right there, is creating the structure. You can see here what looks like a little bit of hardware, and that's connecting the post back to the basement post, all in a line. And another piece here, you can see just barely there, a strap. I was involved with a project just recently, which ended up, we did sit in a room with a couple of lawyers, but it never went to the courtroom. We finished our discussion in a friendly manner that ended up costing the timber framer a lot of money, because as far as we can understand, because the homeowners weren't in the home when this happened, a storm came through, some very unusual straight line winds came through, and the building went very quickly, much like you would get in an earthquake, sometimes like that, either one. And in that moment, some of the timbers in the building were just shattered from the force of a post pushing up on a timber or something else pushing down, or the shearing forces. And it turned out, when we went down below to investigate, that some of these straps to hold the timber post to the foundation were never installed. So the building was just very nicely sitting there until a wind came along and moved it very, very quickly. And so possibly the builder that was supposed to install those connections was at fault, but you know how these things go when there's a problem. Everyone is considered to be at fault, and so the timber framers fix the problem at their own expense to avoid a bigger problem. But it's very, very important to have those connections back to the foundation. You have a heavy building, and in an earthquake or a extreme wind condition, that can feel like no weight at all. So here, I'm going to skip through because I think it's very hard for you to see these. The timber post is to the inside, so we've actually just built a separate wall to the inside. And so because we're doing this, trying to make all the pieces work together, that becomes the insulation for the foundation to the inside of the concrete wall instead of to the outside of the concrete wall. So the timber actually sits just a little bit on the concrete and almost independently on the inside of the building. And another version of that would be to just in those locations, like right there, to pour an extra foundation or to put up with some kind of masonry, an extra support just for your timber posts. So there, a steel column in the middle of the building. So at those locations, you have direct support to the floor. For roofs, there's a good just schematic of those panels all coming in one sandwich, just like the walls. And then over top, maybe half the time I see that done to create another airspace for ventilation, and also to allow the roof to stay cold on top of the panels, to avoid, I don't know how you would call it here, ice damming. Does that make, you know what I mean? So ice buildup on the roof as melts water on the roof and then refreezes. But I'm doing a lot of projects, a number of projects like this too, where the timber frame would stop, let's say right there, and just conventional manufactured trusses on top for a roof, or this kind of situation where the timber frame stops there and then just conventional rafters on top. And I think that can look fine in a building. This project, this is Danish style here, no basement. And we're doing what we call Larson trusses. I guess that's after the name of the person who invented them. Just a very light double wall that can be, instead of building two walls separately to make that, about 30 centimeters thick, you build that double wall in a panel with just small connectors, and that all goes up as a piece. And I've done just a few of those over the years. Just a couple more things about, I thought maybe lighting, definitely a consideration. I really like this kind of highlighting of the timber frame here. Now with the LED lighting, there are so many different options. It's very hard before to find good options to light the frame, also because you don't have a lot of walls, you don't have a place to put the lighting. Here you don't necessarily want to put the lights on the ceiling, but the cable lighting, which I first learned about from IKEA, so you must have it all over Sweden. I like the mix here. The lighting does its job and the timbers do their job, and they kind of play nicely together. To my eye, I always think this looks like birds up on the telephone wires. It's visually, it looks like maybe you didn't think about it in advance. Same here, just, well, that's a lot going on. But it is nice if you do one of those built-up floors over top of the timbers, then you do have a place for recessed lighting and for your wiring, maybe a better layout than what you see there, but that can be a good solution. Again, I don't mind putting lighting on the timbers. To me, it looks a little jumbled, a little like it wasn't all integrated together there. So I think that's about right. So we have a little bit of time just for questions and further thoughts. Tack.
Okay.